Right now, in the remote hills of northern Nevada, bulldozers are preparing to tear apart one of the most sacred sites in Native American history to build the largest lithium mine in the United States. $12.5 billion, 80,000 tons of lithium per year, and enough battery material to power 1.5 million electric vehicles annually. But here's what Tesla and the green energy lobby don't want you to know. This mine sits on Peehee Mu'huh, the site of an 1865 massacre where the US Army slaughtered dozens of Northern Paiute people, including women and children. And the federal government just approved it without tribal consent. I'm about to expose why Thacker Pass represents everything wrong with America's rush to green energy, why this project could trigger the largest Indigenous rights battle since Standing Rock, and why the lithium powering your clean electric car might be extracted from a mass grave. The engineering madness hidden in the desert. Let me blow your mind with the scale of destruction they're planning at Thacker Pass. This isn't just a mine, it's an industrial complex that will consume 217 million tons of lithium-bearing clay over its lifetime. The operation requires two massive open pits, each over a mile wide and 400 feet deep. But here's where the engineering gets absolutely insane. They're building a dedicated sulfuric acid plant on site that will burn 5,800 tons of waste sulfur daily. The acid production alone will require semi-trailer loads of sulfur shipped in from oil refineries across the western United States. We're talking about 50 to 100 truckloads per day, carrying hazardous materials through rural Nevada communities. And that's just to process the clay into battery-grade lithium carbonate. The $2.26 billion government handout nobody talks about. Here's how Lithium Americas is funding this environmental disaster. Your tax dollars. The Department of Energy just approved a $2.26 billion loan guarantee for Thacker Pass, one of the largest federal subsidies ever given to a mining company. But here's the part that will make you furious. The company is also getting massive tax breaks and land use permits at below market rates. So American taxpayers are funding the destruction of sacred Native American land to benefit a company that's majority owned by Chinese investors. The federal government is also negotiating to take an equity stake of up to 10% in Lithium Americas, meaning taxpayers are both funding and owning part of a project that violates Indigenous rights. The water crisis they're creating. Here's the environmental nightmare that nobody's talking about. Thacker Pass will consume massive amounts of water in one of the driest regions in America. The mine will extract water from Quinn River Valley aquifers that supply ranchers, wildlife, and rural communities across northern Nevada. The company's own studies show that groundwater levels could drop by hundreds of feet, potentially destroying wells that families have depended on for generations. The contaminated water from mining operations has to go somewhere. The company plans to store millions of gallons of toxic wastewater in lined ponds. But those ponds will contain sulfuric acid, heavy metals, and other chemicals that could leak into groundwater for centuries. The massacre site they're mining. Now let me tell you about Peehee Mu'huh, the place where this mine is being built. On September 12, 1865, the US Army attacked a Northern Paiute camp at dawn, killing dozens of Indigenous people, mostly women, children, and elderly. The survivors called it the worst massacre in their tribal history. The site contains burial grounds, ceremonial areas, and artifacts that are sacred to multiple tribes. Under federal law, these sites are supposed to be protected. But the Bureau of Land Management approved the mine anyway, claiming the cultural resources could be mitigated by moving some artifacts to museums. Imagine if someone wanted to build a mine on Arlington National Cemetery and claimed they could mitigate the impact by moving some headstones to a warehouse. That's exactly what's happening at Thacker Pass. The legal loophole that enables genocide. Here's how the federal government is getting away with this. They're claiming that Thacker Pass doesn't require tribal consent because the land is now federally managed. But the land was stolen from tribes through fraudulent treaties and military conquest. Multiple tribes, Northern Paiute, Western Shoshone, and others, have filed lawsuits arguing that the mine violates their treaty rights, religious freedom, and federal laws protecting cultural sites. The courts are allowing construction to proceed while the legal challenges work their way through the system. By the time the tribes win their lawsuits, the sacred sites will already be destroyed. the Chinese connection that compromises national security. Here's the part that should terrify anyone who cares about American energy independence. Lithium Americas is heavily influenced by Chinese investors and relies on Chinese technology for lithium processing. The company's largest shareholder is Ganfeng Lithium, a Chinese company with close ties to the Chinese government. The processing technology comes from Chinese firms. Much of the equipment will be manufactured in China, so America is using taxpayer money to fund a mine that will be partially controlled by Chinese interests, using Chinese technology to extract lithium that will compete with Chinese lithium producers. The environmental destruction that never ends. The environmental impact of Thacker Pass extends far beyond the mine site itself. The operation will generate 1.4 billion tons of waste rock and tailings over its lifetime. That waste contains heavy metals, acid-generating minerals, and other toxic materials that will leach into soil and groundwater for centuries after the mine closes. The sulfuric acid production will release sulfur dioxide emissions that contribute to acid rain and respiratory problems. The habitat destruction covers 17,933 acres of sagebrush ecosystem that supports endangered species like sage grouse and pronghorn antelope. But here's what's really insane. The company claims this is green mining because the lithium will be used in electric vehicle batteries. The jobs myth that hides the truth. Lithium Americas promises that Thacker Pass will create thousands of jobs and boost the local economy. But most of the high-paying construction jobs will go to out-of-state workers with specialized mining experience. The permanent jobs will mostly be equipment operators and maintenance workers. Meanwhile, the mine will destroy existing jobs in ranching, tourism, and other industries that depend on clean water and intact ecosystems. Rural Nevada communities will bear all the environmental costs while getting few of the economic benefits. The surveillance state targeting activists. Here's something that should chill you to the bone. Activists and tribal members opposing Thacker Pass have been subjected to years of government and corporate surveillance. Federal agents have monitored protests, tracked activists' movements, and compiled intelligence files on people exercising their constitutional rights to oppose the mine. Corporate security firms hired by Lithium Americas have conducted background checks on tribal leaders, photographed protesters, and shared information with law enforcement agencies. The regulatory capture that enabled this disaster. The approval process for Thacker Pass reveals how completely the federal government has been captured by mining industry interests. The Bureau of Land Management fast-tracked environmental reviews, ignored tribal concerns, and approved the mine despite overwhelming public opposition. The environmental impact statement was prepared by consultants paid by the mining company. Federal agencies that are supposed to protect public lands and tribal rights instead acted as advocates for corporate interests. The climate hypocrisy that exposes everything. Here's the fundamental contradiction at the heart of Thacker Pass. We're destroying pristine ecosystems to fight climate change. The mine will generate massive carbon emissions during construction and operation. The sulfuric acid production will release greenhouse gases. The transportation of materials will require thousands of diesel truck trips. But because the end product is lithium for clean energy, the entire project gets labeled as climate action. The legal resistance that's growing. Despite overwhelming odds, tribal communities and environmental groups are fighting back through the courts and protests. The Reno Sparks Indian Colony, Summit Lake Paiute Tribe, and other tribal governments have filed federal lawsuits challenging the mine's approval. Environmental groups are pursuing separate legal challenges. Protesters have established camps at the mine site, chaining themselves to equipment and disrupting construction activities. Some have been arrested multiple times, facing federal charges for defending sacred land. Thacker Pass is being watched by Indigenous communities worldwide as a test case for whether developed nations will respect Indigenous rights in the rush to green energy. If the US can destroy sacred sites and ignore tribal sovereignty in the name of climate action, it sets a precedent for similar projects in Canada, Australia, and other countries with significant Indigenous populations. International human rights organizations are monitoring the situation, and some are considering sanctions if the project proceeds without tribal consent. As construction accelerates at Thacker Pass, we're approaching a point of no return. Once the sacred sites are destroyed, they can never be restored. Once the aquifers are contaminated, they'll remain toxic for centuries. But there's still time to stop this disaster. Legal challenges are working their way through the courts. Congressional representatives are asking tough questions about federal funding. International pressure is building. Thacker Pass represents a choice between two visions of America's energy future, one that repeats the historical pattern of sacrificing Indigenous communities for corporate profits, and one that finds ways to address climate change without perpetuating environmental racism. The bulldozers are running, the sacred sites are under threat, and the decision about America's moral future is being made right now in the remote hills of northern Nevada. What happens at Thacker Pass will determine whether America's green energy transition is built on justice or just another form of colonialism. We are committed to releasing 2 videos a week. Like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more visionary builds.